Ice, Emma Symington, Master of Wine, and Poland. Yes, hello everyone. And this is Diversity of South Australia and Ambassador Ice. If you accept, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Piotr, and hello, Emma. Honoured to have a Master of Wine with us, and hello all those people who are joining us for this online tasting. It's quite a novel concept. I've never been involved in an online tasting before, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay for the actual tastings, which feels like the most important and exciting bit. But the reason that I'm not able to stay is because I'll be promoting some Aussie wines at a dinner that I'm hosting here at the Australian official residence this evening, which is a really enjoyable part of my role. So I'm signing in. This is my office at our home, the official residence. So you can see the Aussie flag behind me to make it seem official, and on my lapel as well. Some of those of you who are joining us online will have joined us in person at our annual Aussie Wine in Poland event earlier this year, which is organised by Anya, our wonderful Austrade BDM who leads on Aussie Wine. For those of you who did join us at that event, you will have heard me talking about what an absolute pleasure it is for me as Australia's ambassador in Poland to be promoting Australian wine, because it's something that on a personal level I'm quite passionate about, and have been enjoying exploring Aussie wine for really 30 years, the past 30 years since it was legally okay for me to drink alcohol. So real pleasure to be able to talk about that and promote it with people who are interested, and wherever you might be on the spectrum, from beginner, new to Aussie wine, through to an expert like Emma. So Emma, great to have you part of this event as a Master of Wine, and I think supported by Wine Australia, and Piotr as the owner of Slow Guide for putting on this event. Thank you to both of you. In terms of Aussie wine, won't say too much because I think it's better that I leave that to Emma for the tasting. But from a just sort of personal experience perspective, I just want to really impress upon people how much diversity there is in Australian wine. Diversity in terms of the different terroirs. You know, Australia, as you know, is a huge continent. So we've got many different climates, quite different climates, different microclimates. So if you've got a sort of narrow view about what Aussie wine is, it's time to broaden your horizons, because it's really such a there's so much diversity out there. One of the things that I get quite upset about is when people say, oh yeah, I know Aussie Chardonnay, it's just this big, buttery, heavily oaked stuff, and it's a bit boring, and so 1980s. Well, you really need to update your ideas, because I can tell you that Aussie Chardonnay is some of the very best in the world, and we do of course nice beautifully balanced oak varieties, but we also do really clean, pure, fruit-driven, no oak varieties, and everything in between. So there's something for everyone. The other thing I think that I want to stress is just about the quality of Australian wine. So we, of course, it's a big market, and we're a big producer. So there is things at the discount, lower budget end of the market for sure. But there's things at the absolute premium level on the world stage. And many of our wines compete with the very best that the world has to offer. And if you haven't tried any of those, then you need to, and I encourage you to do so. I mentioned that my own personal journey with Aussie wine began about 30 years ago, and I'm still learning and discovering new things. It's been a real labour of love to explore Aussie wine. And for those of you who get the opportunity to go and visit Australia, then it's really should be a wonderful and enjoyable part of any visit to Australia, is to go and explore whatever the local wine region is in the area that you're visiting, because there'll be something, and you'll be able to find some really interesting things and great quality there. So for the tasting today, I understand that last year there were 2 of these events. This year there is just the one, and the focus today is on South Australian wines. For those who don't know, South Australia is one of our largest, I mean, it's a state, but it's one of our largest producers of wine. South Australia produces some of Australia's most iconic premium wines that are known around the world. But we also produce in South Australia many new world varieties that you probably never heard of, and are worth exploring because it's a wonderful, wonderful state for growing wine. The climate is incredible. Everything from our big, bold, full-bodied Shirazes that we're known for, through to some smaller produced varieties that are absolutely premium and wonderful. So that's probably enough talk from the ambassador, because people want to get into the tasting and hear from Emma. I wish I could see you all. It's one of the limitations of meetings like this. I can see Emma and Piotr, but I'd love to see all your faces. Hopefully you're smiling and you're excited about getting on with the tasting. So thanks very much for the opportunity to open this, and I shall hand back to you, Piotr and Emma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. And now, Emma, let's start. Yeah. Floor is yours.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
And bye. So, hello again, everyone. I don't know if some of you maybe joined the couple of webinars I ran last year. So I'm back again, and we've got some delicious wines to taste through today. So as Ambassador Hayes just mentioned there, Australia really is all about diversity in terms of the different regions, in terms of the climates of the wine producing regions and different grape varieties and so on. So today we are focusing on one state, being South Australia. But we're really talking about that diversity message within South Australia. Now, I digress. I probably should just quickly introduce myself and explain who I am. So my name's Emma Symington. I am a Master of Wine. I'm based in England, just south of London, and I work for Wine Australia. So Wine Australia being the generic regional body for Australian wine. I look after education and covering the UK and European markets. So just going out and talking to people about Australian wine and educating people a bit more about the different wine regions and varieties, and hopefully exciting people about Australian wine. So that's why I'm here today. And as I said, we've got a really nice selection, I hope, of wines to taste through. But just before we get into the wines themselves, I've just got a few slides to share, just to kind of set the scene, give you a little bit of an overview, a bit of an introduction, and then we'll dive into the wines and taste and talk through those regions in quite a lot more detail. So just quickly to start off, just a bit of history, as I said, really to set the scene. Now, of course, Australia is a New World wine producing country, and it is not home to any Indigenous grapevines. So in order to start making wine in Australia, people had to take vines across to Australia. Now, that actually happened with the first fleet in 1788. So those first settlers who moved over, the first colonists who moved over to Australia, took, of course, with them all different sorts of horticultural and agricultural produce, amongst them being vine cuttings. So they were planted in Botany Bay when they landed in 1788, and the first vintage is actually recorded as 3 years later in 1791. But it wasn't really until the early 1800s that things kicked off in terms of viticulture, and it became a much more important part of the industry. And there's one important man who's mentioned on this slide here, James Busby. So he is often called or considered the grandfather of the Australian wine industry. Now, he was actually Scottish. He was a horticulturalist by trade, and he moved over to Sydney in 1824. And when he got to Australia, he became interested in viticulture, and so started working within viticulture, and then got a job with the Australian government at the time. And at that time, the Australian government really wanted to increase viticulture in Australia. They had this idea that Australia could become the France of the Southern Hemisphere, And so they wanted to bring more grape varieties into Australia in order to start planting more vineyards. So James Busby was sent back to Europe, to France and Spain, and he spent 6 months travelling the wine regions of France and Spain, and he was tasked with gathering cuttings of different grape varieties in order to then take back to Australia with him. So over those 6 months, he gathered about 600 different cuttings, all of different grape varieties. They were all packaged up and then sent back with him to Australia, landing in Sydney in 1832. Now, 437 of those cuttings survived the voyage, so just over 100 didn't, and the rest did. And they were then planted, propagated on, and further cuttings were taken and then sold to growers across Australia. So he was really important because he brought in a lot of different grape varieties into Australia in those early days. And then, those varieties were then sold to growers across Australia. And by the middle of the 1800s, there was commercial viticulture in every state in Australia. So it really didn't take very long for people to start, buying these cuttings of vines, planting their own vineyards, and then making and selling their own wine. And we're focusing, of course, on South Australia today, and the first vineyards there were in what is now McLaren Vale. They were planted in 1838. So again, right at that beginning of the 19th century. And interestingly, it wasn't just about domestic production at the time. As I said, the Australian government had this idea about, becoming the France of the Southern Hemisphere. They really had this ambition to create high quality premium wine. And part of the reason for this is, of course, Australia at the time were part of the British Empire. So the British Empire wanted Australia to start producing high quality wine with the vision of sending it back to England and to other parts of the empire for people to drink and buy. And the first export of wine from Australia across to the UK was in 1854. So, Australia really has a very long history of exporting its wines right around the world. Then moving on, the next era, as you can see, was around about the start of the 20th century. So throughout the 1800s, everything pretty much that was made in Australia was table wine, particularly red wine, a little bit of white wine, but particularly red wine. And then it changed really quite dramatically and very quickly as times moved into the early 1900s. And really this change was a change in demand away from table wine, as we're tasting today, and towards fortified wines. So this was a change in demand domestically within Australia. So people started to want to drink more fortified wines, but also a change in demand in the export markets, and particularly here in the UK. So this is when Rutherglen was a very important wine region, producing Rutherglen Muscat, and places in South Australia like Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale really shifted their production, so away from table wine across to fortified wines, so producing kind of port style fortified wines. And this didn't really change until after World War II. And the reason again for this change was a change in demand. So after World War II, there was a big influx of immigration into Australia from countries in Europe, particularly like Italy and Croatia and so on. And these were people with the social mores of wanting to drink table wine at the dinner table alongside food. So these people were coming into Australia and growing that demand for table wine. And this helped to shift demand overall away from fortified wines and back to table wines, as you see here throughout the middle of the 20th century. And then the sort of in the last, 50 plus years has been what we call the golden age. So this is when really Australia has become very well known on the global scale, exporting to many, many more countries, big increases in plantings as a result. And you can see here on this slide, by the early 1980s, Australia was the 18th largest wine exporter. Just 10 years later, it risen to the 6th largest exporter. So again, that's just underlining this huge increase in plantings that happened towards the end of the 20th century, and that big increase in exports around the world. So today, Australia sits as the 5th largest exporter of wine in the world, And somewhere between 60 and 70% of everything that is produced in Australia is sold in export markets. So exports are a really important part of the Australian wine industry. And really the reasons for that is that although Australia is a very large country, it's actually very small in terms of population. There's only about 26 million people in Australia, which I know is far less than you have in Poland. So because of that relatively small domestic market, this is why exports are so important for the Australian wine industry. Now, any of you who attended my sessions last year will definitely have seen this map, because I pretty much like to show it in every session I do, because I think you can never emphasize enough just how big Australia is. Ambassador Hayes mentioned earlier how huge it is. It's a continent-sized country, and as you can see on this map, it is bigger than Europe. So again, just reinforcing just how big Australia is. Now, to put a bit of scale on here, if you fly from Perth over in Western Australia across to Sydney, that's a 5-hour flight. It's just over 3,000 kilometres, and you'll be crossing 3 time zones. So it really is a huge country. And another little fun fact I like to share, Australia is actually bigger than the moon, which I know sounds totally crazy, but the moon, in terms of its diameter, is 3,400 kilometres, and Australia at its widest point, east to west, is 4,000 kilometres. So again, just another nice way of just reinforcing the idea of how big Australia is. And of course, this is really important when it comes to me talking about the diversity of wine regions, of climates, of topographies right across Australia. Yes, it's one country, but it's a continent-sized country, so it has that huge diversity within it. Now, unsurprisingly, when there is such a big country, of course, there are a lot of different wine regions, 65 of them, in fact. Now, many of these, particularly the smaller ones, we very rarely see in the export markets. Probably only about 10 to 20 of these we regularly see on wine labels in the export markets. But nevertheless, there are these 65 different regions, and they really all do have their own kind of characteristics, personality, identity in terms of the climate, their topographies, the elevation, soil types, of course, and therefore what grape varieties are planted there and what styles of wines are produced. Now, given everything I've just said, that Australia is the 5th largest exporter of wine in the world, you know, it's a continent-sized country, it's bigger than Europe, and it's got 65 different wine regions. I think often people have this kind of preconceived idea that Australia produces a vast amount of wine. But the reality is actually quite different. As you can see here, there's only about 146,000 hectares of vineyard area in Australia. That's about 4% of global plantings. Or to put it another way, it's about the same amount as is in Bordeaux and Burgundy put together. So again, remembering the size of Australia compared to Europe, let alone compared to France, let alone compared to these 2 regions within France, you can see there's not a huge amount of vineyard area spread across Australia. But as I said, I think the reason people often think Australia perhaps produces more wine than that is because so much of its wines do get exported, as I said, between 60 and 70%. So this is why, you know, the wines are very prevalent on many export markets, certainly where I'm based in the UK anyway. And so this is often what gives people this preconceived idea that Australia perhaps produces more than it really does. So today we are focusing, as I said, on South Australia. So South Australia, in terms of the size of the state, is just under 1 million square kilometres. This map here is just a small snapshot of South Australia. If you look at the little map of Australia itself at the bottom, you can see actually where South Australia is. This is just focusing on where the wine regions are. But just under 1 million square kilometres. So that's about the same size as Germany and France put together. And within South Australia, there's only 1.8 million people. So again, just underlining how relatively small in terms of population Australia is. But as Ambassador Hayes mentioned, South Australia really is the most important state within Australia in terms of wine production. About 52% of all plantings in Australia are within South Australia, so just over 76,000 hectares. And that is split across 18 regions, as you can see on this map. Now, today we're looking at 8 of those, so a nice little snapshot across the state. And the ones we're looking at are the ones I've just circled there in red, so you can have an idea of what we've got ahead of us. Now, just before we get into the tasting, I've just got a couple of slides of some stats to show you, just again to reinforce some of the production within South Australia. So firstly, this is looking just at South Australia by region, and this is a percentage of the crush in 2023. So this is volume of wine produced in 2023. So you can see of the South Australian regions, Riverland is by far and away the most important wine region in terms of volume produced. 62% of everything in South Australia comes from Riverland. The next biggest being Barossa Valley, then Padthaway, Langhorne Creek, McLaren Vale, Clare Valley, and then you're getting down to some of the smaller regions. But just quite interesting to see how important Riverland is as a region in terms of volume. And then this is looking at plantings of grape varieties within South Australia. So here you can quite clearly see that Shiraz is by far and away the most important or most planted grape variety in South Australia. So 38% of all plantings in South Australia are Shiraz. Then you go down to Cabernet Sauvignon. The next variety below that is Chardonnay, Merlot, into some of the smaller ones. And then this grey bar you can see, which is 11%, is other. That is really all of the alternative grape varieties and everything else that is planted in South Australia. Remembering that there's more than 150 different grape varieties planted in South Australia. So although, of course, you know, these big ones, Shiraz, Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, account for a lot in terms of percentages, actually, you know, all of these alternative varieties and lesser known varieties actually together do account quite a large percentage within South Australia. And then I've just got a couple of slides on exports to Poland, because I thought you might be interested in this. So this first is looking at exports just from South Australia. So I haven't included the rest of Australia. So just from South Australia. And this is by label claim, so by regional label claim. This is year to date from March this year, so the past year. So you can see of exports going into Poland from South Australia, ones labelled just as South Australia are the most important. That's about 65% of the total. But then from a specific region, Barossa, that's that orange bar you can see, that's about 11% of exports going into Poland. And then you're heading down into McLaren Vale next, Eden Valley, and I think, is it Langhorne Creek next? So yeah, a number of different regions there, as you can see. Now, I should clarify, so this is our export data. So Wine Australia, as well as, you know, working in terms of education and marketing, we actually grant all the export licenses for any wine being exported out of Australia. So we have amazing data in terms of exports going to different countries. But what we can't get access to is any exports that, say, are sent to one country and then re-exported to another country. So this is just wine coming directly from Australia into Poland. We're aware, of course, there will be other wines coming into Poland which may come from within other European countries, but we can't access that data. And then secondly, this is exports of South Australian wine, again to Poland, and this is by variety label claims. So again, just seeing what's coming into Poland by grape variety, or what are the most important Australian grape varieties in Poland. So Shiraz, perhaps unsurprisingly, being number one. 38% of all South Australian wine coming into Poland is Shiraz, which nicely is the same amount as Shiraz plantings within South Australia. So there's a nice little link there. Cabernet Sauvignon, again, is number two. That's about 22%. Then you're down to Chardonnay at 18%. Sauvignon Blanc, and then Riesling and so on. So again, nice to see those different varieties going into Poland and what's most important for consumers within Poland. Okay, I think that's enough of an introduction. So we're going to head into the tasting now. This is what we've got ahead of us. Hopefully you can see I've tried to include as much diversity as possible in terms of different grape varieties, in terms of different regions, different styles of wines. As I said, as we taste through the wines, I'll give you quite a lot more information about each region as we taste through them, and the wines themselves, of course, as well. So at this point, I'd suggest do start pouring yourself the first wine, the Pussy-Vale Eden Valley Riesling. I'll talk about the region as you're pouring, and then hopefully by the time I get to talking about the wine, you all have it in your glass. And if you could do the same as we go through all the other wines, that would be great. Okay, so we're starting off in the Eden Valley, which as you can see is northeast of Adelaide. It's about an hour and a half drive out of Adelaide. And also, as you can see, it is right next to Barossa Valley. But these two places are quite different to each other. Barossa Valley is that lower lying valley floor, Mediterranean climate, pretty dry, hot summers, cooler, wetter winters. And it is where Shiraz, Grenache, Mourvedre, etc. do really well in that lovely warm Mediterranean climate. The Eden Valley, on the other hand, is actually not a valley. Confusingly, it's an elevated plateau that sits alongside but above Barossa Valley. So it sits between 200 to 300 meters higher in terms of elevation. So this makes Eden Valley very much cooler in terms of climate and also much windier, which again has that cooling influence. So this is why Eden Valley is particularly well known for Riesling, having that cooler climate than Barossa Valley. Now, I've included a few of these maps as we go through for each of the regions because I think it gives you a slightly better idea of some of the topography within the regions, and it also shows you exactly where the vineyard sites are in each region. So these dark green kind of blobs that you can see, they are the actual vineyard locations in each region. So these are maps we've created using remote satellite imaging software to give us those exact vineyard locations. So you can see Barossa Valley is pretty densely planted. There's nearly 10,000 hectares within the Barossa Valley, that being that warmer, very much more Mediterranean climate. Eden Valley, on the other hand, is much more sparsely planted. And you can also make out this official sub-region called High Eden. So this is the clues in the name here. This is very much the highest part of the Eden Valley. So here you're heading up to about 550 meters in terms of elevation. So very much cooler, particularly than down on the Barossa Valley floor vineyards. So this is really the part of Eden Valley where Riesling really dominates. Riesling's king. Okay, so the first one we've got is from a winery called Pussy-Vale. This is their estate Riesling. Now, Pussy-Vale was established originally back in 1847, so it was one of the very first vineyards in the Eden Valley. But sadly, by the 1920s, the vineyard had all been pulled up. Remembering at that time, cool climate viticulture was pretty tricky in those early days of viticulture, and I think this is the reason that by the 1920s, this vineyard had been pulled up. And of course, remembering that this was the time in Australia when really the demand was all for fortified wine production. So Eden Valley, particularly this part of the Eden Valley being very much a cool climate region, really wasn't very well suited to producing fortified wines. So this is what's resulted in the Pussy-Vale vineyard being uprooted by the 1920s. But then the site was replanted in 1961 by the Hill-Smith family, who own the Yalumba winery nearby. It's a single vineyard, single estate, single variety. So it's a single vineyard, all planted of Riesling. They do make a number of different Rieslings under the Pussy-Vale label, but all from this single vineyard within High Eden. As you can see, this is sitting up to about 490 meters in terms of altitude. It is certified organic and biodynamic. certified from 2013. So this vintage, this is their 10th vintage of being certified as organic and biodynamic. Wild fermented, as you can see, but beyond that, in terms of production, this is really straightforward Riesling winemaking. So the grapes will be picked, crushed, fermented in stainless steel, fermented to dryness, as you can see here, and then bottled relatively young. So this is all about preserving that lovely purity of fruit within the wine and that beautiful searingly high acidity, which is what you get from this cool climate part of the Eden Valley. So I'm just going to pour myself some. Do have a taste if you haven't already. So to my mind, this is absolutely classic Eden Valley Riesling, that beautiful high line of acidity, lots of kind of lemon and lime flavors in terms of citrus. But then there's really nice floral note as well. It's got some real aromatics to it, which is probably different to Clare Valley Riesling. So we don't have any Clare Valley wines here today, I'm afraid. But Clare Valley is another region within South Australia and probably the other region that's best known for Riesling. And typically it tends to be a little bit firmer in terms of acidity. And it doesn't really have those floral notes that I'm certainly picking up in here. I don't know if you are too. So I think a couple of questions have come through. So let me see. There's some ideas to make sparkling wine from Riesling in that region. Good question. I've not come across any, and I don't believe there is any sparkling Riesling. I've had some sparkling Riesling definitely from Tasmania. So there's a bit of Riesling in Tasmania, and certainly Joseph Cromie Winery makes a sect style from Riesling, but I haven't had any in Eden Valley. That's not to say it doesn't happen. It's quite possible there is a producer making it, but it's certainly not something I've come across. But what we are seeing more of now, interestingly, in both Eden Valley and Clare Valley, is wineries playing around with a little bit of residual sugar. So the classic style is this style made in that absolute bone dry, high acid style. But a few wineries are beginning to play around with, maybe 10 to 12 grams of residual sugar. So not a huge amount, but just enough to soften off some of that acidity and give a slightly broader texture and weight, which is a nice sort of change of style, something a little bit different. And Jola says, what would you combine with it food-wise? Oh, good question. I mean, for me, really, this is just singing out for any really, really fresh seafood, but something quite simple. Be it oysters or some just very simple prawns, perhaps a bit of sea bass. You could do something with some slight Asian flavors, a little bit of lime and chili and soy, I think would be lovely. But you wouldn't want anything too powerful in terms of food, because I think there's a real lovely delicacy to this wine and you wouldn't want to overpower that in any way. And the other thing really worth mentioning about this wine is this is a wine that will age for decades in bottle, 10, 20, perhaps even more in terms of evolution and maturity in the bottle. And that's really because of this amazing acidity and also this concentration of fruit. These are wines that will age for a really, really long time and age and evolve and mature over that time. So although this is their kind of basic sort of mid-tier, I suppose, Riesling, they go up from here in terms of price points. Even this is going to age really, really nicely in bottle. Anya, what about Crozer from Petaluma? So Crozer does make a sparkling, but that's a Chardonnay Pinot Noir blend, not Riesling. Okay. I hope you're all enjoying that. I think it's a really nice wine to start off a tasting, gets those taste buds going. And certainly here in England, we've got a beautiful, warm, sunny day, and it's exactly the right sort of white wine to have in that weather, I reckon. Any other comments on the wine or questions before we move on? No. Right, if you're happy on that wine, do pour it out, pour yourself the next one, and I will start giving you a bit of a chat about the Adelaide Hills. So our second wine, we are in a region called the Adelaide Hills. Now the clue very much, again, is in the name here. These are hills just outside Adelaide, as you can see. And again, zooming in a bit, you can see the Adelaide Hills in terms of area is a really big region. It's about 75 kilometres north to south and around about 20 kilometres east to west. Again, it did have some vineyards back in the mid 1800s, but a bit like I was just talking about with the Pusey Vale vineyard, everything was grubbed up by the early sort of about the 1920s. Again, because of the problems with cool climate viticulture, or it was quite a hard way to work, but also because of this change in demand domestically within Australia across to fortified wines. And again, the Adelaide Hills really being a cool climate region within South Australia, so not really suited to making fortified wines. So after about 1929, something like that, there was no viticulture at all in the Adelaide Hills, and things didn't really start again until 1971. And Brian Crozer, who Anya just mentioned in the chat, he set up Petaluma in 1976. So he was really one of the pioneers restarting viticulture in the Adelaide Hills and sort of putting it on the map as a wine region. As you can see, again, we've got a couple of official subregions, being Piccadilly Valley and Lenswood. Now, the Adelaide Hills, in terms of elevation, is quite varied. So the highest part of the Adelaide Hills, which is where, in the central part, which is where these subregions are, sits up at about 600, 650 metres in terms of elevation. So this makes that part of the Adelaide Hills by far and away the coolest climate wine region within South Australia. This is where there's a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, made not just for still wine, but also for traditional method sparkling wine, which again should give you a real idea of how cool this part of the Adelaide Hills is. But then as you head north, you're heading up towards the Barossa Valley and Eden Valley. As you head east and as you head south, that elevation decreases down to around about 300 metres in terms of elevation. So there is this quite big diversity within the Adelaide Hills in terms of climates and microclimates. So as I said, that central higher part of the hills is very much cool climate. But as you head to some of those more extremities, it does get a little bit warmer, albeit a warmer part of a cool climate region. So, a moderate temperature, I suppose, rather than anything particularly hot. But this makes the Adelaide Hills really interesting because of this huge diversity in climates in terms of elevations, and it also has a huge patchwork of different soil types. So it's a region that, although it's not widely planted, as you can see, there's only just about 3,000 hectares within the Adelaide Hills. There's a huge diversity in terms of different grape varieties that are planted there. So, of course, you've got all the sort of most famous grape varieties in Australia, as I mentioned, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, as we've got here. There's also some Cabernet Sauvignon. There's certainly a bit of Merlot. There's a bit of Shiraz in some of those warmer sites, albeit often labelled as Syrah, so showing that cool climate sort of heritage. But it's also a region where there's a lot of the so-called alternative grape varieties. So these emerging varieties that are planted in relatively small hectarage, but giving more diversity to the region. So it is the region that is becoming a kind of real soft spot or hotspot for Gruner Veltliner in Australia. So there's a number of different producers of Gruner Veltliner now in Adelaide Hills. As a variety, it seems to suit the region really well, with that elevation giving a high diurnal variation as you get in Austria. And parts of the region have these very slaty soils, which again seems to suit Gruner Veltliner very well. So it's a really interesting region and a lot's going on there. And the wine we have is from a winery called Dandelion Vineyards, and this is their Wishing Clock of the Adelaide Hills Sauvignon Blanc 2023. Now, Sauvignon Blanc is a relatively new story within Australia. I mean, it's been in Australia for a long time. I think it was one of the varieties that Busby may well have brought over back in the early 1800s. But it's only really within the last kind of 20 years that plantings have begun to increase and more people have been interested in Sauvignon Blanc. And of course, that's partly because of the huge importance of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc around the world. And so Sauvignon Blanc generally, in global terms, has come a huge way in the last 10, 20 years. So unsurprisingly, we're seeing more plantings going in Australia. That being said, across the whole of Australia in 2023, Sauvignon only accounted for just over 6% of total volume, so tiny amounts. And within South Australia, only 3% of plantings are Sauvignon Blanc. So there's really not a huge amount of Sauvignon Blanc in South Australia. That equates to about 2,000 hectares. And what there is primarily in the Adelaide Hills. It seems to be a region that really suits Sauvignon Blanc very well. Some of it's grown at some of the higher sites. This particular vineyard is around about 350 metres. So some cooling influence of elevation, but not right up in those higher spots. So have a sip of that. I will pour myself some. Now, what I really like about Adelaide Hills Sauvignon is there's always this restraint to it. I think sometimes you have Sauvignons from other parts of the world which can be incredibly pungent, really powerful and almost over the top in terms of the aromatics and the intensity and the concentration. Whereas here, and to me, this is a very typical style of Adelaide Hills Sauvignon, you do have that more restraint. So you do have this, of course, sort of zippy, citrus and grassy kind of notes. But overall, it has that restraint. So it's not too much in your face. It's much more elegant. And to my mind, that makes these styles of Sauvignon much more food friendly. You know, you've got many more options of food matching with this type of Sauvignon rather than some of the really intensely pungent styles, which can really quickly overwhelm food. It also, in my mind, makes these much more drinkable. I'd much rather have 2 or 3 glasses of this, whereas some of the very intense styles of Sauvignon, you know, 1 glass is really more than enough because it is so overwhelming. So I hope you're enjoying that. Again, I think it's a lovely wine on this hot sunny day that we have here. I don't know what the weather's like for you in Poland. Hopefully you have the same.
Well, any comments, guys? Come on. It's not so hot here.
Yeah. Is it not? Oh, that's a shame. Oh, well, once we get onto the reds, you'll be right at home then.
Right? How do you like it?
Someone is typing. How do you like it, Piotr?
Well, I do. Well, actually, I tasted a bit earlier some of the wines, and I must say I think the next 2 are my favorite.
Fair enough. They're very different in terms of style.
Okay. Oh, we love it.
With clams.
They love it. Right. So don't be shy and make some comments. Just prove your existence, right? Good.
Absolutely.
Emma?
It's always nice to know what you all think about the wines. Right. We will move on then to our next wine. So again, feel free to finish that one if you haven't already, and then start pouring yourself wine number 3. Raphael says nice and fresh. Absolutely. That's really what this wine is all about, that buzzing sort of zippy freshness. It really kind of dances on the palate. I think it's really lovely. Again, a nice wine to start the tasting with. Okay, for our next wine, we're down to this tiny little region called Mount Benson, which I imagine many of you have never heard of before. It's actually a very new region. The first plantings in Mount Benson were back in 1989. So within Australia, it is one of the newest wine regions, alongside Robe, actually, which is just alongside it. Now, this part of South Australia, this whole southern part of South Australia, is known as collectively as the Limestone Coast. So that should give you an idea of what soil type we're on here, or what bedrock, I should say, we're on here, being, of course, limestone. We're about 3.5 hours drive south of Adelaide. So again, just giving you an idea about how much further south we've gone. Now, Mount Benson, as you can see, is a pretty small region in terms of area. It is along the coast, so unsurprisingly very maritime in terms of climate. And as you can see, really not much planting at all. There's only about 500 hectares currently within Mount Benson. So it is a pretty small wine region. It's planted with both red and white grape varieties. And of course, here we have a Chardonnay to taste through. In terms of climate in Mount Benson, as I said, very maritime, real maritime influence because of this ocean influence. Now, this ocean right across the southern part of Australia is called the Southern Ocean. It's a very cold ocean, so all those waters come up from Antarctica. So cold ocean, moderating the climate. And then typically you get these southerly breezes, these southerly winds. So these southerly winds are cold winds because they're picking up all of that cold air from above the ocean and then pushing it on land. So Mount Benson does have some viticultural hazards, wind, of course, being one of them, and frost as well, particularly late spring frost can be a real problem in Mount Benson. So again, that should give you an idea that this is a cool climate and cool because of that maritime influence. So the wine we have is from a winery called Norfolk Rise, and this is Where the Wind Blows Chardonnay. Now, Chardonnay, as Ambassador Hayes mentioned earlier, has really come on a bit of a roller coaster journey within Australia. It's a variety that has been in Australia since, the 1800s. And back in the late 20th century, so the 1970s, 80s, 90s, it was really one of the great varieties that put Australia on the global wine map. And at the time, the Chardonnays that were produced were picked quite late in the vineyard, so ripe, if not overripe, in terms of fruit profile. So lots of really quite ripe tropical fruit notes, mango, pineapple, things like that. And they typically then were aged in a lot of new oak, so giving lots of kind of buttery, spicy, vanilla-y, coconutty characters, and often with a lot of malolactic fermentation, so giving that creamy texture, and again, those kind of buttery notes. And as I said, this is a style of wine that was really, really popular, very important through the 80s, 90s. But then what happened, and this happened really on a global scale, is people moved away from that style of Chardonnay. And this is when Sauvignon Blanc suddenly became hugely in favour. And people didn't want this big, bold, buttery style of Chardonnay. And what we've seen in the last kind of 20, 30 years with Australian Chardonnay is a huge change in terms of style. So where once they were the big, bold, buttery Chardonnays, what you have now is people are picking a little bit earlier. So retraining all that freshness, getting more acidity in the wine, tend to have a lot less oak influence. So as you can see here, this is only 20% in oak, new oak, but the rest of it wouldn't have been in oak at all. So just a little bit of oak to add some complexity, but in no way to kind of dominate the wine, and also a lot less malolactic fermentation. So what you get now is much more elegant, restrained styles of Chardonnay. And I would certainly argue that some of the top Chardonnays in Australia really are on a level with, the best Chardonnays from any other region around the world. And particularly today with Burgundy pricing going absolutely stratospherically through the roof, a lot of Australian Chardonnays offer incredible value for money just in terms of their quality to value ratio. So again, have a taste of this if you haven't already. So I think this really shows you nicely that more modern style of Australian Chardonnay. You have this beautiful freshness running through it. So the grapes aren't picked too late. So that lovely freshness and those kind of citrusy notes coming through. A bit of oak, certainly, but that's just giving this lovely nutty kind of complexity. And then really, really long on the finish, but staying fresh and elegant. I think that's really delicious. Jola says, a new region for us, great discovery, nicely rounded wine, very universal as far as food pairing goes. Absolutely, I fully agree with you. These wines, well, this style of Chardonnay, because you have that acidity, it can blend with a lot of food, but you have these layers of flavour as well, which again, you can match with different sorts of food groups. So this winery, Norfolk Rise, or this particular vineyard, is only about 5 kilometres away from the coast. So very much that maritime influence. And I think Where the Wind Blows as a name, again, should give you an idea of what I was talking about, those cold, southerly winds that come across onto Mount Benson. So again, that cooling influence. And the reason it's called Norfolk Rise is because the main drive that runs through the vineyard, they have these big Norfolk pines growing. So quite important for the winery. And again, they were chosen because of their ability to withstand these winds that typically blow through the vineyard and the region. So again, just reinforcing the maritime influence that we have in this particular part of Australia.
And this is the retail price, the 50 zlotys?
This is what I've been told. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, very nice.
Good. You're pleasantly surprised. Well, as I said,
Yes,
I think value for money with Australian Chardonnay is really pretty impressive these days. So again, as I was saying, this is the limestone coast. So this is sort of sandy loam soils above limestone. And again, that's helping give that beautiful brightness and elegance to the wine. I have to say, this was a wine that I hadn't tasted before today, and I think it's really delicious. And as you say, brilliant value for money, and just the sort of wine that you can imagine drinking in many, many different occasions and situations. And really nice to be able to taste a wine from a lesser known region as well. Right, so the next sort of little trio of white wines are all based on grapes from the Southern Rhone. So quite nice if you have the option, I don't know if you do or not, but if you have the option to pour 2 or 3 of them at once so you can compare and contrast, that would be great. If you don't, really not a problem at all, but I just thought I'd mention in case anyone has more than one glass in front of them, it might be a nice way to do a bit of comparing and contrasting. Okay, so for our fourth white wine, we are back in the Barossa. Now, what I didn't mention earlier, as I talked to you about the Barossa Valley and the Eden Valley and their difference in climate, so Barossa Valley being that much more warmer Mediterranean climate, Eden Valley being higher and cooler. Now, together, they form the Barossa. So if you have a bottle of wine like we have here, which is labelled Barossa, not Barossa Valley, just Barossa, that means the grapes can come from either of these regions in any proportion. Now, of course, if a wine says Barossa Valley, it has to be minimum 85% from that region, as is the same in, regional laws around the world. But if it says Barossa, it could be 80% Barossa Valley, 20% Eden Valley, it could be 60-40, it could be 50-50. It's entirely up to the winemaker as to what they want to do. And so often the winemakers in Barossa Valley refer to the Eden Valley as their bonus wine region, because the ability to be able to blend from a cool climate region gives them so much more sort of diversity and opportunity in terms of their winemaking. So I think I pretty much showed you this map earlier. So the wine we have is from a winery called Langmeil. This is their Three Gardens Viognier Marsanne Roussanne, as is labelled, though as I've noted on here, it's actually Viognier Marsanne Roussanne and Clairette. So there's 4 different grape varieties within this blend. And this is a Barossa wine. So some of the grapes will have come from the Barossa Valley and some will have come from the Eden Valley. And those different vineyard sites sit between 100 metres in terms of elevation, so down in the Barossa Valley floor, up to 500 metres up in the Eden Valley. I'm afraid I don't have the information as to which grape varieties are planted where. My guess is the Viognier is probably up from Eden Valley. Marsanne and Roussanne probably more down from the Barossa Valley floor. They're grape varieties that need that little bit of extra heat, but I don't have exact facts on that. And as you can see in terms of winemaking, this has spent some time in oak, but only in old oak. So this isn't about adding any kind of oak flavouring into the wine. This is just for maturation and just to give a little bit of broadness and richness in terms of the texture. So again, please have a taste of that one. So all of these grape varieties, of course, are originally from the Southern Rhone. Marsanne has actually been in Australia since the 1800s. It was one of those grape varieties that James Busby brought over from his travels. But Viognier, Roussanne and Clairette are all actually much more recent entrants. So Viognier was originally planted in 1980 up in the Eden Valley by Yalumba, which we'll be talking about next. And Roussanne, much more recent, that's actually only been in Australia since the 2000s. So quite a new variety for Australia. But I think there's increasing interest in this kind of style of white wine from different parts of Australia. So this idea of making something a little bit more textural than perhaps is more classically known in Australia. So quite broad in terms of texture, but that lovely kind of freshness coming through here, which you get from these varieties. So I think what's nice here, you can pick out those kind of Viognier notes, a bit of apricot and peach, that kind of floral lift. But you then have that slightly weightier palate, which is really what the Marsanne and particularly the Roussanne are giving to the wine. So again, I think this would be a lovely sort of food matching wine because of that texture and weight on the palate. This is the sort of wine that can match many, many different food types. And just as an aside, the Three Gardens, the name here. Oh, I don't know why that moved on. The Three Gardens, the name here. That is because the original vineyards, the original winemakers in Barossa refer to their vineyards as gardens. So that's why this is called the Three Gardens. Barossa as a region was a very one of the original regions planted in South Australia back in 1842. It was originally actually settled by German immigrants, and these were Germans from the Lutheran religion. They were escaping religious persecution in Europe, which is why they moved sort of en masse to Australia and settled in the Barossa. So if you go to the Barossa today, you'll still see there's this real Germanic influence in the region. Both in terms of place names, in people's family names, in terms of some of the food and the produce. And of course, it's still the centre of the Lutheran religion in Australia. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed that wine. So then the next of the whites, the Yolumba Samuel's collection Viognier. Again, if you can do a bit of comparing and contrasting, I think this would be a nice one to be able to. So I mentioned Viognier first came into Australia or first planted, I should say, in Australia in 1980. And that's because Yolumba planted it. So Yolumba have their own nursery. So they are able to import vine cuttings, put them through quarantine, and then sell them on to other growers across Australia. They actually got hold of some Viognier cuttings from another nursery within Australia that was never been planted commercially. And they did the first commercial planting back in 1980. And I think it's fascinating because today Viognier is a great variety that is so well known around the world and planted in so many regions. But for a while, it nearly went extinct. And I think we can really thank Yolumba for kind of grabbing the world's attention again with Viognier and sort of putting it back on the map. And I said it became nearly extinct because back in 1965 in the Rhone, where Viognier is from, there was only 8 hectares remaining of Viognier. So a tiny, tiny amount, and that was absolutely in decline. And as I said, it really wasn't until, the 1980s when Yolumba started planting Viognier and people really suddenly became interested in it as a great variety that plantings globally have started increasing. And Yolumba now have the largest plantings of Viognier in the Southern Hemisphere. So again, have a taste of this if you haven't already. We've just collectively decided to move to South Australia. I mean, it wouldn't be the worst plan in the world. It is a beautiful state. So many different places to visit and see. Amazing food, amazing wine, beautiful climate. You can't go far wrong, to be honest. So as I said, I think this is an interesting one to compare to the Langmile that we just had, because obviously the Langmile was, 50-odd% Viognier. This is obviously 100% Viognier. And you can see those similarities, albeit this doesn't quite have the weight and texture of the first one. This is all about Viognier. So this is all about that lovely scented, floral, kind of rose petal style, a bit of lychee in terms of fruit. But it's also softer and creamier, I would say, than perhaps the Langmile is, whereas the Langmile is a bit more textural and weighty. This has a lovely creaminess and a real softness on the palate. Jola's loving the wine. Great. Very elegant, I would agree. There's a lot going on there, isn't there? There's a real intensity in terms of flavour. And just an absolutely classic Viognier aromatics and flavour profile. It's the sort of wine that if you got in a blind tasting, you'd be really happy, because I think this couldn't be anything other than Viognier. But again, I think what's really nice here is it's not over the top. Sometimes you have a Viognier and it's just too intense, too pungent, too floral, too creamy, whereas this has got a nice acidity, which is just keeping everything fresh and elegant. And it has this, real restraint to it again. Really lovely wine. So I hope you're enjoying sort of mentally comparing that to the Langmile, because I think it's interesting to see the similarities and differences between the two wines, one being a single varietal and one being a blend with that variety in it. Now, our final white wine, definitely get in your glass now, because I think it does need a bit of air to open up. I think ideally it's the sort of wine you'd almost decant or double decant. I hope you'll see why when you taste it, I imagine. So I'm just going to pour that for myself now. And then I shall tell you a bit about it and its region. So our final white, let's work, here we go, is from a region just south of Adelaide called McLaren Vale. So this was the first wine region planted in South Australia in 1838. Now, remembering South Australia was a free settled state, so unlike the other states in Australia where there was a lot of convicts sent across to Australia as a workforce, South Australia was just free settlers, primarily settled by a lot of particularly British people moving over there. Though, as I said, particularly with Barossa, there was other nationalities that went out too. McLaren Vale was the first wine region planted in 1838. As you can see today, again, a bit like Barossa Valley, it is fairly densely planted. There's just over 7,000 hectares in the McLaren Vale. It is a beautiful region. As you can see, on one side, you've got the coastline. So you've got these amazing golden sand beaches, beautiful clear turquoise waters. And then towards the east, you're heading up into the foothills of the Adelaide Hills. So you have this lovely sort of band, a ridge of hills along the east and to the south. So having this difference in topography across the region. So it just makes it absolutely really, really beautiful to go and visit and see. In terms of plantings there, really a lot of Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache, which we'll talk about a bit later. But it's a region that, again, is really important for alternative emerging grape varieties. So things like Vermentino, Fiano are nice, Nera d'Avola, Sangiovese, all sorts of different things. Menthia, there is now in McLaren Vale, Pitpool, all different sorts of things. I think there's this real drive for experimentation and innovation and trying new things. So it really is one of the regions where lots of exciting things are happening. Now, this particular wine is from a winery called Yangara. They're based up in Blewett Springs. Now, there isn't any official sub-regions within McLaren Vale, but there are a few unofficial sub-regions. If I just get my pointer, hopefully you can see this. Up this way is where Blewett Springs is. So hopefully you can just pick out that this is slightly higher in terms of elevation. This is actually some of the first sites that were planted in McLaren Vale. So I think this particular vineyard is at about 170 meters in terms of elevation. So picking about 2 to 3 weeks later than down in this part of McLaren Vale, which is almost at sea level. So much higher here. So you get these winds that come in either from the ocean, so from the west, or also down off the Adelaide Hills. So again, that's giving that cooling influence. So slightly cooler site, this part of McLaren Vale. Right. So, as I said, this is from Yangara. Now, Yangara, the winery, have become very well known for their Grenache. They make some really incredible Grenache and from vines that are very, very old. It's something they've become really well known for. And yeah, as I said, making some incredible wine. More recently, they've become interested in growing some of the other sort of southern Rhone grape varieties. And of course, on a white side, one of them being Roussanne. So that's what we have here. So as I said, Roussanne only came into Australia in 2000s. And I think this was planted not too long after that. So although the vines are still less than 20 years old, they're probably among some of the oldest within Australia. The estate is all certified organic and biodynamic. And as you can see here, in terms of fermentation, this is very much sort of modern style winemaking in Australia, around the world. We do have some skin contact here. So 59% of the Roussanne here has been wild fermented on skins in ceramic eggs, and it spent 121 days on skins. The rest of the wine, so the other 41%, also wild fermented, but without skins in amphorae. So this skin contact is all about just getting a bit more phenolics into the wine. So that sort of slightly like tannin, so giving you that slight grip around the palate, but it also gives you this lovely bitterness. Now, Roussanne as a variety is relatively low in acidity, so having this bitterness, which is coming from these skin phenolics, is giving you that impression of freshness, even though the actual acidity level isn't necessarily that high. And I hope this is giving you an idea really of this huge diversity in styles of white wines within South Australia. You know, we started with the Riesling and the Sauvignon being really fresh aromatic styles. Here we've got kind of really the other end of the pendulum. So much more textural, weightier style of white wine. So have a taste of that one.
Emma, do you have any idea of the price level of this wine?
Good question. I don't know, actually. It's not going to be cheap. None of Yangara's wines are. I mean, they are well known for wine lovers within Australia and within, their key export markets. I don't know. I can quickly Google in a minute if I get a chance. But I'm afraid I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, I will try to Google it.
Brilliant,
But,
thank you. You really, really like this one. Great.
Yeah, I do. I shouldn't say perhaps, but I really like this one. What about you guys? Do you like it or not? Thank you, Poznan, for making comments. Now, what about Białystok? Anybody? Katowice?
So I think this, to me, is a real contemplative wine. It's a wine you need to kind of sit with and think about. There's so much going on there, but it doesn't shout. It's just really gentle. But as I said, there's so much texture and flavor, and I think it's just delicious. And I love this saline note that's running through there, which again is coming from this kind of skin contact and skin fermentation, and again giving you that impression of real freshness in the wine. Amazing. Great. I'll take that. It's delicious, isn't it? Yes, very complex. I fully agree. Yeah, you just keep getting this layers and layers of flavor, and it's so long. Yes, a really beautiful wine. A wine you definitely want to share with people who really love good wine, and then just sit and enjoy it and talk about it for a while. Okay, well, I hope those 6 wines give you a really nice snapshot, as I said, of this diversity of styles of whites coming out of South Australia. Everything from your easy drinking, kind of everyday, I suppose, style of white wine, to ones which are much more special to have with a special occasion and with appropriate food. Yeah, I've certainly enjoyed tasting through those. But I know time's ticking on, so we better move on to our red wines. Although the first red wine, of course, is a sparkling red wine, just to kind of set the scene. So the first red, the sparkling, we are in a region called Langhorne Creek, as you can see, south east of Adelaide. It's about an hour and a half drive out of Adelaide. It's, again, one of the earlier regions within South Australia, planted in 1870. And if I move on a slide, you can see there's quite a lot of plantings in Langhorne Creek, about 6,000 hectares. So really only a little bit less than McLaren Vale. But I think the interesting thing about Langhorne Creek, it's sort of not really very well known as a region. And from a long time was a region that often wasn't on wine labels. It was a region that often used to be blended with other regions, and so didn't really have its own identity, but was really prized by the winemakers for giving this kind of intensity and power and concentration. So, it's one of those regions that kind of flew under the radar for a really long time. And it's only more recently that wineries have realized how special it is as a region and how important it is to put that region kind of on the wine label and start talking about it as a region rather than allowing the fruit just to be blended in with other wines. So in terms of climate, it's sort of dominated by winds blowing across the Southern Ocean. So I've talked about winds in the Southern Ocean quite a lot. So if I click back to this slide, you can see, let me just grab my pointer. So this is the Southern Ocean here, and the winds all come up from the south. What happens, they push across this big lake here, which is called Lake Alexandrina. So again, this has this cooling influence pushing across onto Langhorne Creek. And because it's next to this lake, they have this really great system of irrigation. So it is a region where you can produce high cropping fruit, you know, lots of quantity, but that is certainly not the case in the wine and the winery we've got to taste today. So this is from Bleasdale. Now, Bleasdale were the first winery in Langhorne Creek, set up in 1850. So one of the very first family-owned wineries within South Australia. And as I said, we've got their sparkling Shiraz. Now, sparkling Shiraz really is something that's quite iconically and uniquely Australian. Nowhere else in the world really makes wines quite like this. So I think lovely for Australia to have this quite iconic style. So typically when making sparkling Shiraz, you'll be making a still red Shiraz first, albeit trying to limit the amount of tannin you're getting out during fermentation. So, you know, not too much extraction during fermentation. So getting all the lovely fruit flavors and aromatics out of the Shiraz, but limiting the amount of tannin. And then turning it into sparkling wine. Now, some sparkling Shiraz goes through traditional method fermentation. This one is actually a tank method, so Charmat, as you get in Prosecco. So not having the autolytic flavors necessarily, but just a method of creating this kind of fresh and fruity style of sparkling Shiraz. As you can see, this is the base wine for this has been matured in a Solera system of old oak barrels and tanks. And this Solera dates back to 1997. So every vintage, they add more wine to this Solera. And then the new bottling is 50% of the new vintage wine with 50% of wine that's come out of the Solera. So the Solera system is adding lots of complexity and concentration to the wine, but with that fresh new vintage wine going in there, adding this sort of aromatic and lively fruitiness as well. So do have a taste of this wine. Hopefully it's a nice sort of segue between our whites and heading into our reds. Now, sparkling Shiraz as a style tends to be a bit of a Marmite wine, so people either love it or hate it. Personally, I think this is delicious. So much kind of real vibrant red cherry fruit, lovely vibrant acidity, and then there's just delicious bubbles. And it's the sort of wine that I can absolutely imagine drinking, you know, on a summertime afternoon with a barbecue or something. Just a really lovely different style of red wine. A nice thing to sort of surprise and delight guests with, I suppose. I would love to know your thoughts on this wine. As I said, it's one of those wines that people have quite strong opinions on normally. But I think it just slips down so beautifully. Typically in summer in Australia, is obviously Christmas is in summer in Australia, and this is sort of traditionally the style of wine that a lot of people will drink on Christmas Day, which you can imagine. Christmas in Australia obviously is not so much about the turkey. It's probably about, you know, shrimps on the barbie outside on a lovely hot sunny day, and you can just understand why this wine just would match that so beautifully. Really very special wine. I love it. Excellent. Yes, and as you can see, this is imported into Poland, so you should be able to buy it from somewhere. Just really nice to try those quite unusual styles of wine, hey? Surprising, great balance and lovely nose and taste. Yeah, I fully agree with you. Absolutely. And beautifully surprising colour. It's really vibrant, isn't it? That almost kind of purpley tinge to it. Even though it's got so much old wine in there, it's that lovely vibrance really showing through. Okay, we better move on. So our next wine is actually a blend of different regions. So it's partly from Riverland and partly from Adelaide Hills, which I've already talked about. Now, Riverland, as you can see, is inland in South Australia. So very much a continental climate, hot, dry summers, cooler, wetter winters. And if you can remember from what I was talking about at the very beginning of the session with our stats, this is really the kind of powerhouse region, if you like, for South Australia. This is where a huge amount of the volume and the production comes from. If I move in here, there's about 22,000 hectares of vineyard within Riverland. So really, really big region in terms of production. There is, of course, a lot of wine here that goes into more bulk wines. So, you know, lots of the big branded wines, supermarket own brand kind of wines. A lot of those grapes will come from Riverland. That being said, there are more than 80 different grape varieties planted in Riverland. So it really is not just about big branded Shiraz and Cabernet and other grapes. There is a lot more to Riverland than perhaps how it is necessarily perceived as a bulk region. And I think certainly within the last kind of 10 years or so, there's been a real upsurge of interest in the Riverland, particularly from younger winemakers. And I think that's partly because fruit is very accessible in Riverland. Prices aren't as high. For example, if you're buying fruit from McLaren Vale or Barossa Valley or, you know, one of the better known wine regions. And as I said, there's also this huge diversity in terms of grape varieties planted in the Riverland. There are a lot of these, you know, emerging alternative grape varieties planted there, as well as the mainstream. So that means there's a lot of choice, a lot of diversity. And so there has become this real interest particularly from younger winemakers, experimenting with fruit from Riverland and making some really, really quite exciting wines, of which I would argue this is one. So this is a winery called Unico Zelo. They're based in the Adelaide Hills. And as I said, this is a blend of fruit both from the Riverland and the Adelaide Hills. Unico Zelo is owned by Brendan and Laura Carter, so young winemakers, and they're really all about making beautiful, fresh, vibrant, exciting styles of wine. Very much that kind of contemporary Australia model. This is mostly Nera d'Avola. Now, Nera d'Avola is one of the alternative grape varieties, of course, planted in Australia. I think there's only just under 100 hectares currently within Australia, but it is absolutely one of these grape varieties that is growing in interest and more people are planting. And that's because it's a grape variety that seems to be very well suited to a lot of these warmer climates, particularly within South Australia. And it's a variety that doesn't need as much water in the vineyard as something like Shiraz or Cabernet Sauvignon would do. So, of course, somewhere like Riverland, being inland, being very continental in terms of climate, really is dependent on irrigation for viticulture. And of course, the growers have to pay for that irrigation water. So if you can use something like Nera d'Avola, which needs less water input in the vineyard, actually you're saving money rather than planting something like Shiraz. So it is becoming increasingly important. And then the second grape here, Zabibo, that is what the Australians called Muscat of Alexandria. So it's a white grape variety, adding kind of lift and freshness. The Zabibo comes from Riverland, but it's all old vine fruit. And again, this is something a lot of people don't realise about Riverland. There is an amazing amount of old vine and Zabibo there, sort of 50, 60, 70-year-old vines that were planted, you know, a while ago when people were making different styles of wines. For a long time, really weren't desired by winemakers, but now more and more people are becoming interested in this old vine fruit. And as you can see here, using it in different styles of wine. So again, have a taste of this if you haven't already. This is in fact the only wine, apart from the sparkling, that's under cork. It's under DM. Everything else was under screw cap. So as you might get from the label, Fresh AF, this is really all about freshness and vibrance. It's really zippy and aromatic. It's a sort of wine that you probably want slightly chilled. Again, particularly in the summer, just giving you that freshness and lift. And really is just showing off, how some of these contemporary styles of wines are being made in Australia, and very different to some of the kind of more classic styles. Is Nera d'Avola spreading throughout other regions because of its uniqueness? I think, well, as I said, there are a lot of grape varieties in Australia today, over 150. So, and 130 plus of those are what we would call alternative or emerging grape varieties, of which Nera d'Avola is one. So I think it's increasing in interest, partly because of the styles of wine it makes, this lovely, fresh, vibrant, fruity style of red wine, but also, as I said, because it needs less water input in the vineyard. In terms of irrigation, it also holds its acidity really nicely. So it's just turns out much better suited to some of these regions than perhaps what was originally planted in them. And I think that's happening on a broad scale across many Australian wine regions and many grape varieties. These original plantings, particularly of some of the French varieties, possibly weren't the right varieties to plant in those regions in terms of what's appropriate to the climate. And I think this is driving some of this change in regions towards some of these alternative grape varieties, which particularly in a changing climate now with climate change and global warming, these are possibly the varieties of the future. It's very, very fruity. I fully agree with you. And that's what it's meant to be. This is just all meant to be about easy drinking, vibrancy, aromatics, freshness, and pure drinkability, really. Right, moving on. So our next red, we are back in McLaren Vale, just south of Adelaide. And here we have Grenache. So to my mind, Grenache is one of the grape varieties that is so exciting at the minute in Australia. I think the way Grenache has been made and grown in Australia has changed so dramatically within the last really only about 10 years. And is now making these beautiful, vibrant, aromatic, elegant styles of Grenache. And elegant, certainly for a long time, was not a word anyone would use with Grenache. And this kind of renaissance of Grenache is something we're seeing in other regions around the world, of course, as well. Certainly in Spain, the Gredos Mountains, parts of South Africa, parts of California. Again, people are realizing how to make this much more elegant, aromatic style of Grenache. And what's really changed was that I think for a long time through the mid-20th century, people in Australia and around the world just didn't really rate Grenache very highly as a variety, and didn't really pay it a lot of attention. And in terms of winemaking, they tended to produce it very much like a Shiraz. So picking it quite late, which gives you lots of really jammy kind of fruit characters, lots of intensity, but just jamminess. And then they tend to do lots of extraction in terms of the winemaking, and then often maturing in oak and a new oak. And what you ended up with is this quite sort of jammy, oaky red wine that didn't really taste of any particular variety, and certainly didn't really taste of the region it came from, what the Australians would call a dry red. Now, it's, as I said, it's only really in the last kind of 10, perhaps 15 years that there's been this realization that with Grenache, you shouldn't treat it like Shiraz. You need to treat it much more like Pinot Noir. So people are now picking much earlier, so retaining that freshness and that acidity, much more gentle winemaking. So typically winemakers will refer to infusion rather than extraction. So certainly not, really hard punching down, just very, very gentle extraction. And then only maturing in old oak, or in many cases, no oak at all. And this is what's giving this much more vibrant, elegant, aromatic style of Grenache that is just light years away from where Grenache used to be 15, 20 plus years ago. So this is from a family-owned winery called Angove. They are based up in Blewett Springs. This vineyard is based up in Blewett Springs in McLaren Vale, so not far from where Yangara is that I was talking about earlier. So again, that slightly higher part of McLaren Vale. These, as you can see, these vines were planted in 1947, so a really decent bit of vine age on here. And again, this is really something that's very special in particularly in McLaren Vale and Barossa Valley. There's a lot of old vine Grenache, 50, 60, 80, 100 plus year old Grenache, which again, when it comes to Grenache, I think you need to have old vines to give you this kind of complexity and concentration of fruit. Young vine Grenache is fine for rosé and very simple red wines, but if you want to make something with a little bit more structure, a little bit more seriousness, you need these old vines. So really amazing for McLaren Vale and Barossa Valley to have these old vine vineyards. So again, have a taste of that one. So as you can see from the winemaking here, this is carbonic maceration with whole bunches. So this is allowing some of that intracellular fermentation, which is giving that lovely sort of vibrant, pure primary fruit notes. It's actually carbonic maceration for 12 days, at which point the wine is pressed and then fermentation is finished in open fermenters. So mostly it goes through carbonic, but then it is finished with normal alcoholic fermentation. And then 15% is matured in older French oak puncheons. So puncheons being 300-litre barrels, so a bit bigger than barriques. So as I said, this isn't about having any oak flavour in the wine. This is just about maturation and getting that lovely texture. And I think what's lovely about this wine is it's kind of more serious than you initially think. Looking at that, you go, carbonic is going to be light and bright and juicy. But actually, this is a really serious wine. It does have that elegance and vibrance, but then it's got these layers of flavour and concentration. And I think it's delicious. Jola, true power from this one, yet not overwhelming. Great wine. Exactly. Fully agree with you. Yes, and this is really why I get so excited about this kind of style of Aussie Grenache. I think they're just really beautiful wines, and just the journey Grenache has come on has been so exciting.
And this specific wine has no distributor in Poland, right?
So Angove are distributed, but that distributor doesn't bring in this particular wine currently. But maybe you should just ask them to.
Okay. So having a vine of Grenache, I'm obliged to make for first 30 years, I believe, rosé, and then I get nice old vine, and I can make some serious reds, right?
I would agree with you generally, yes. I think, yeah, old vine Grenache is really when you get these layers of flavour, and I always get a bit of kind of Chinese five spice and some herbaceous notes coming through as well. It's just when you get a lot more complexity.
Okay, guys, any comments? Oh yeah, they are. Yeah, and don't forget the photos, right? Yeah, don't forget the photos. Otherwise, Emma won't come back, right? Next
Yes,
year.
I would love to
Or,
see some photos of you all.
yeah, very well. Thank you.
Okay, so for our next wine, again, it will be a nice one to kind of compare either directly or just in your mind, because we're sticking in McLaren Vale, but we're going to another winery called Darrenberg, and this is their Darry's Original Grenache Shiraz. So 64% Grenache here with 36% Shiraz. So you can see the difference between a 100% varietal Grenache that we've just had, and here where we've got a perhaps slightly more traditional blend of Grenache and Shiraz. So have a taste of that one. Shall I have some too? So the winery here, Darrenberg, are probably one of the best known wineries within McLaren Vale. The winemaker there, Chester, is certainly quite ostentatious. He's an amazing man, huge personality. So if you've ever met him, you're never going to be able to forget him. He's got some brilliant stories. And they've also built the Darrenberg Cube on their vineyards in McLaren Vale, which is now a huge tourist attraction. It looks like a Rubik's Cube. It's quite an incredible building. But because of all these things, it really is a very well-known winery and making some amazing wines. So I think really interesting to taste this, because you can see that Grenache fruit coming through, that lovely red kind of juicy fruit. But this Shiraz is just giving a bit more plushness, a bit more body, a bit more concentration in the blend. So it is quite different to the single varietal Grenache. I'm also certainly picking up a bit more kind of eucalypt mintiness on here. I don't know if any of you are as well. I think of the two wines, the Grenache you could quite happily drink on its own or just with some charcuterie or something like this. Whereas this wine, I think, needs something a little bit more more intense in terms of a food matching. I think this could go with many different food matches, but it just needs a bit of food because it is slightly more concentrated and intense, and it's got a bit more tannic structure as well, which would really match well to some food. I think someone's typing. I'll see what is said, and then we can move on to the final two wines. Great wine. Love the fruity hints and eucalyptus too. Oh, good. Someone else is picking up the eucalyptus. Great. Okay. So our second to last red, we are down to a different region called Coonawarra, which, as you can see, again, is in the southern part of South Australia. So again, this is part of the limestone coast sort of broad region, as we were in Mount Benson. Now, Coonawarra, in terms of its climate, is maritime. It's a relatively cool climate. It was originally planted in 1881, which I always think is fascinating because it's kind of in the middle of nowhere today. It's about 5 hours drive from Melbourne and about 4 hours drive from Adelaide. So, you know, thinking back to how long it would have taken anyone to get there in 1881 is quite mind-blowing. As you can see, as a region, it's relatively highly planted, just under 6,000 hectares. So although it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, there is quite significant vineyard plantings here, 64% of which is Cabernet Sauvignon. So Cabernet is really king in Coonawarra. It's what it's best known for. And it's a really interesting region for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I said, it's got this maritime climate, albeit it's 100 kilometers inland, which is kind of fascinating because usually if we're talking about maritime climates, we're saying that maybe goes 50 kilometers inland, you get that maritime influence. So having it 100 kilometers inland is quite unusual. And the reason you have this maritime influence so far inland is because of how flat it is, how flat the land is. Coonawarra, they often refer to as being as flat as a pancake. And it is that sort of lack of topography that exists all the way to the coast in Coonawarra. So there's no ranges of hills or ridges or really anything to stop these cooling ocean breezes coming so far inland. So this is why you get this maritime influence in Coonawarra. And the other reason you get this maritime influence is because of an ocean current called the Bonny Upwelling. Now, this is a map of ocean temperature. Obviously, that kind of light browny colour is the land mass of Australia, looking right across South Australia here. And the coloured areas is the ocean. And then there's reds, oranges, yellows are those warmer ocean waters. As you head down into the greens and blues, it's colder. And as you can see, just off the limestone coast, and you can see where Coonawarra is pointed out, is this real band of very, very dark blue water. So this is incredibly cold water. So this is the Bonny Upwelling. So it's very cold water that is come from far, far deep down in the Southern Ocean that pushes up just off this limestone coast area. So this again is why you have this maritime influence in Coonawarra, because you can imagine that you get these southerly breezes picking up all that cold water, that cold air from the ocean and pushing it inland towards Coonawarra. And of course, this was also influencing the climate in Mount Benson, as I was talking about earlier. So this Bonny Upwelling is really important right across this limestone coast kind of zone of South Australia, having this cooling maritime effect. And then the other important thing in Coonawarra is the soil type, which is terra rossa. So this is this band, as you can see, of iron-rich loam sitting above a base of limestone. So limestone in the limestone coast. Limestone is obviously free draining, so all the water can drain through it, and it also allows the vine's roots to root very, very deeply. So this iron-rich topsoil has some nice fertility, and then it allows the Cabernet Sauvignon roots to go very, very deep down into the soil, which again is something that's very special about Coonawarra. Okay, so this is the wine we have from Coonawarra, back from Yalumba, the winery we were talking about before. So this is their vineyard site in Coonawarra, and this is their cigar, Cabernet Sauvignon. So have a taste of that one. So to me, this is absolutely classic Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon. You have that kind of core of lovely cassis and blackcurrant fruits, but lots of layers of real quite savoury spice, and it's more restrained than Cabernets from some other regions, and a slight herbaceous, again, slightly minty note as well. Really lovely fine-grained tannins, and then this nice acidity running through it too. Again, these are wines that age decades in bottle quite happily. They really are made for the long haul with all that lovely structure, kind of intensity of fruit core. So climate-wise, Coonawarra is often compared to Bordeaux, so it's about as cool as Bordeaux. Again, having that maritime influence as we get in Bordeaux. And of course, on Bordeaux's left bank, where Cabernet is king, you have these free-draining gravel soils. And that free-draining soil is exactly what we get in Coonawarra with that Terra Rossa over the limestone. So this really is why Cabernet is so well suited to Coonawarra. It really is one of the most important Cabernet Sauvignon regions within Australia. What's the difference between a puncheon and a hogshead? So a hogshead is 300 litres and a puncheon, sorry, I got it wrong earlier, as a puncheon is 500 litres. So it's just a slightly bigger size barrel. And this is generally something we're seeing in Australia, both in whites and red wines, is many winemakers are moving away from barriques, so 225 litres, towards some of these slightly larger format oak barrels. Again, just to have a little bit of less oak flavour impact on the wine, but still have that maturation from aging in oak. Yola says, besides steak, what would be the best food pairing? I mean, personally, I love a bit of lamb with Cabernet like this. I think just because of that acidity and the tannic structure, it just goes really well with a slightly fattier meat. If you're not a meat eater, something aubergine way or a kind of mushroom risotto or mushroom ragu, something with lots of umami kind of flavors would be really delicious as well. Right, and then for our final wine, we are heading back up to the Barossa. So as I said earlier, this is about an hour northeast of Adelaide. And the one thing about the Barossa we haven't talked about so far is old vines, because it is such an important part of the Barossa story. So, old vines, I think, is something different regions around the world are really beginning to talk a lot about now. It's becoming a really important topic, generally within the wine trade. Barossa, I think, were really ahead of the curve because they set up their old vine charter back in 2009. And at the time, the topic of old vines wasn't really as important as it is now. But they realised at the time how important old vines were to the region, and they really wanted to kind of shine a light on all these amazing old vine vineyards. So as you can see, sorry, I'm just going to shut my door. As you can see, there's 4 categories of old vine vineyards, starting old vines at 35 years or more old, survivor vines at 70 years or more old, centenarian vines at 100 years or more old, and then heading up to ancestor vines at 125 years or more old. So really increasing in age up the charter. And really the reason they set up these old vine charter is because there are so many old vine vineyards within the Barossa. Well over 20% of all vineyards in the Barossa are classified as old vine or older, and there's over 200 hectares within the Barossa which are ancestor vines. So really incredibly huge number of vineyards which are these very, very old vine vineyards. And then beyond that, Barossa is actually home to some of the oldest vines in the world of a number of different grape varieties. So the oldest Shiraz in the world is in the Barossa, that was planted in 1842. The oldest Grenache in the world is in the Barossa, planted in 1850. The oldest Mourvèdre in the world is in the Barossa, planted in 1853. And the oldest Cabernet Sauvignon in the world is in the Barossa, planted in 1888. And the reason all these amazing old vines exist still in the ground are because there is no phylloxera in South Australia. Now, remembering back, in Europe, towards the end of the 1800s is when phylloxera arrived in Europe. across from America, and it decimated all the vineyards in Europe. And so over time, all the vineyards in Europe, or 99% of the vineyards in Europe, had to be uprooted and replanted on grafted American rootstock. Now, phylloxera did arrive into Australia around about the same time, into Victoria, but the South Australian government of that time realised how much of a problem this could be, and so they closed the borders. They closed the South Australian borders. They didn't allow any new plant material into South Australia, either from outside the country or from states within Australia. And this is what has kept South Australia phylloxera free to this day. So this is why all these old vines are still in the ground, still on their own roots. I think over 70% of vineyards within South Australia are planted on their own roots, so they're not on grafted rootstock. So really an important part of the Barossa story. So this is our final wine. I will pour myself some and have a taste. So this is from a winery called Henschke, who are based up in the Eden Valley. But this, again, is a Barossa wine. So some of the grapes have come from Eden Valley and some have come from the Barossa Valley and blended together. As you can see, this is a blend of Shiraz, Grenache, Mataro, and a little bit of Viognier. And that Viognier is actually co-fermented with the Shiraz. So just to add a little bit of aromatics and lift, and also just to intensify that colour. And really this wine is just all about that lovely, fresh, vibrant, pure, juicy fruit. And again, a nice texture. This isn't really a simple wine. There's a lot going on there. But just, yeah, really easy drinking and vibrant. Delicious. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that final wine. Do let me know if you've got any questions or comments.
There's one laconic comment, but I think it means the best.
The best. Great.
I think so, yes. Anyway, the most frequent word in the comments is love. They love something or it's lovely. So,
Brilliant.
It's a love country.
I can't ask for more than that, can I?
Okay, and someone's saying amazing. Yeah.
What a great end. Good. So I just wanted to put this final slide up, just if any of you are studying for WSET exams or any other wine exams. So this is our education website, australianwinediscovered.com. It's where we have all of our education materials. All our maps are on there. There's modules covering all the key grape varieties and regions. There's video content, there's quizzes, huge amount of information. So it's kind of your one-stop shop for anything you might want to learn about Australian wine. And it's all free and easy to access. So do take note of that if it might help you with your studies. I really hope you've enjoyed that session and sort of got a snapshot of some of this diversity that you get in South Australia in terms of grape varieties and obviously in terms of styles of wines that are made there. And in the regions, of course, that they come from. So I really hope you've enjoyed the tasting. Thank you for listening for me for a couple of hours. If you've got any more questions, please do quickly pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I think that's me done.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. Someone is still typing something. And, it's the third time online, if I remind, or yes, third time. So it's time to come here right, for you to show in person, right?
That would be great. I would love to.
Yeah. So, yeah, let's meet in person in Warsaw, in Poland, anywhere, in Poznań perhaps. And thank you very much. Anybody?
Brilliant. Thank you all so much.
No, it's just thank you and thank you.
All right. I hope you all really enjoyed the wines, and I hope you get to have another glass of some of them now as well.
Well, great. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, guys. Hope to see you here, Emma, and hope to meet soon, guys.
All right.
All
Thank
of you.
you. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.